So as I sort of alluded to in the previous lesson, this series will focus in on how to create your games for mobile devices using ActionScript 3.0. What the course is not designed to be is a beginner's guide to Flash. So that means that I'm going to assume while we do this course that you have some basic knowledge of Flash, that you know what the timeline is, what the stage is, some of the tools, where the ActionScript panel is, and so on. However, I will use this lesson just to give us a quick crash course in the basics, just so that you have a refresher as we move forward with this series. So to get started, you'll first need to open up your copy of Flash CS6. And once you do this, by default, you will have a splash screen where you can create templates or new documents and so on. You'll be mostly focusing in on the center column here. And the two main documents we'll be using most, I would say, are the Air for Android and Air for iOS documents. Now, if I, for instance, use an Android document and you only have an iOS device and you only want to program for the iOS device, feel free to choose Air for iOS if I ever choose Android or vice versa, because the real main differences lie in the dimensions of the stage when you create these documents. Of course, the real change comes in when you export, because that's a whole different process in itself. But again, if you want to focus primarily on one platform or the other, and if I choose an opposite of that, feel free to choose the one that you want to focus in on. Now, the other documents we'll be mostly picking are the ActionScript files, which we'll be using quite a bit, and we might touch on the ActionScript 3.0 class files. It just kind of depends on where the gaming process takes us as we proceed forward. So let's first just click on Air for iOS, just to kind of get started here. So you'll see when we do this, we have a new document. And if I zoom out here, you can see that the document dimensions are kind of that in the shape of an iPhone. And if you look on your properties inspector, you can see that you have the dimensions set. And those are the recommended dimensions for creating an iOS app in Flash. So you probably don't want to change those, as that's pretty much set how it is. So from here, we have a few things we can look at. First, we have the stage, which I already pointed out. Basically, the white area is what your audience is going to see. So anything in the gray area will not be visible to your audience, which probably isn't going to be such a big deal for us, as we'll mostly be bringing a lot of elements in using ActionScript. Next, you have the timeline. And the timeline, again, isn't going to be the primary focus of this series, but this is where we can lay out animation. This is where we place our ActionScript. We will place it on a particular frame, and so on. And we can also name our layers. Layers are another thing we'll be working with. So there are several things there we can work with within the timeline, but it won't be as big of a focus as if this were an animation tutorial series. You have your tools here on the right. And again, a lot of these are drawing tools, and we might be touching on the drawing tools as we continue on here when we create our assets for our games. But I'll probably be just touching on that stuff as we move forward with it. Just know that here you'll be finding your drawing tools when we create our projects. Also to the right, you have, of course, a properties inspector, which will be useful when we need to set instance names and such, and I'll be getting into that when the time comes. And then you have the library. And the library will be used to store symbols, and our symbols will be our assets for the games that we'll be creating. And so you can reference the library to bring in copies of other existing symbols and to alter the symbols if need be. If ever you need to access these two tabs and they're not available to you, you can always go up to Window and you'll find Library, and you will find the properties also in the Window menu. So that's a little bit about the interface. Mostly we'll be focusing in on ActionScript. That's just the primary focus of this series. And so you'll be going to Window and Actions quite a bit. Also, you can always hit F9 on your keyboard to access the Actions panel if you wish. And sometimes it can be found as an icon. If I can move my window here. right down here. So you'll usually find it sometimes down there as well, depending on the workspace and how you adjust your workspace. But the ActionScript panel is a coding panel, and we'll be focusing primarily on that to type out our code and to create our games. Finally, just to touch on, if you go to File and New, let's say we create an ActionScript file, you won't have access to the timeline or the library. You'll simply have just a coding window. It's almost as if you're using a text document. From here, you can lay out your code and you can code out anything which we can then import into the main document for our app. So that's just a little bit about the interface. And again, it's best if you know a little bit about Flash. You'll probably learn some things along the way. But if you have any questions, please refer to any series that pertains to the basics of Flash, or you can, of course, look that stuff up online through books, articles, and so on. I would also like to note, too, that if you are not using CS6, but CS5 or CS5.5, you should still be able to do most of what I'm doing in this series. And the interface should be very similar to that as well. And I will try to make my project files that I bundle with this, my work files that is, that I bundle with the series, to be backwards compatible with you guys who are using CS5 or CS5.5.